The summer of 1992 in Springfield, Missouri, felt heavy, as if the air itself knew something unspeakable was about to happen. The heat clung to the streets, the smell of cut grass mixed with cigarette smoke drifting from porches and in neighborhoods where children once played after dark. Silence settled in earlier than usual. Graduation week had filled the town with parties, nervous laughter, and the restless energy of teenagers standing at the edge of adulthood. Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall had just crossed that threshold, tossing their caps in the air, imagining a future far larger than the quiet limits of their city. Susie was 19, sharp-witted, independent, proud of the new waterbed she had insisted on setting up in her mother's modest home. Stacy was 18, kind-hearted and steady, the sort of girl her friends could always rely on. And then there was Cheryl Levitt, Susie's mother, a woman of 47 who had worked her whole life to provide stability, sacrificing her own dreams to give her daughter a chance at freedom. She was a hairdresser, a chain smoker, a single mother who hid her loneliness behind a quick smile and endless work. On June 6th, Susie and Stacy moved through their night like countless other graduates, drifting from party to party, laughing at jokes that already felt like memories. Cheryl spoke on the phone late that evening with a friend, planning to paint furniture in her bedroom, unaware that this would be the last time anyone would hear her voice. By 2 a.m, Susie and Stacy decided to leave her friends' crowded house and return to Cheryl's home on East Delmar Street, promising to meet their friends the next morning at Whitewater Amusement Park. They never made it. In the hours that followed, the house became a grave of silence. Cars untouched, purses abandoned, cigarettes left in their packs. The family dog yipping into the night like it had seen something it could not explain. 3 women erased as though a hand had reached into the house and pulled them out of existence. This is where the story begins. Susie Streeter was the kind of girl who drew attention without trying. Petite blonde, with a scar on her arm and a stubborn streak that often put her at odds with people who underestimated her. She had been through the turbulence of teenage rebellion, dropping out of high school for a time, getting tattoos that marked her independence, but in 1992 she was beginning to find her footing again. She had her mother's tenacity, the ability to hide wounds behind a strong front, and she was fiercely loyal to her friends. Stacy McCall was different. She was the gentle counterbalance, cautious where Susie was bold, grounded where others spiraled. She came from a family that watched her carefully. Her mother Janice, always worrying about safety, pushing her toward responsibility. Stacy was the kind of daughter who promised to call home, who folded her clothes neatly before bed, who did not vanish without reason. Together, the two girls had been inseparable that night, moving from party to party, their laughter echoing through the early hours as if they had the entire summer ahead of them. What neither of them could have known was that eyes were watching, that somewhere in the drifting shadows between their last goodbyes and the quiet house on Delmar Street, something was waiting. And then there was Cheryl. She had lived a life of responsibility, working long days at the salon, coming home to smoke cigarettes and watch late-night TV. She had no enemies, no scandals, no reason to be caught in the storm that was about to unfold. Yet fate bound her to that night. By 11:15 she had ended her phone call, ready to sleep, her daughter and Stacy still hours away from returning. The stage was set, 3 lives moving toward a convergence they did not choose, a trap carefully sprung in the comfort of home. And when the morning came, the world would awaken to find them gone, leaving only the echo of their presence, purses on the floor, jewelry on the counter, a dog scratching at the walls. What happened in those missing hours is a question that has haunted this city for decades. The final hours of June 6th bled into the darkness of June 7th, and Springfield was alive with the careless energy of graduation night. Susie and Stacy drifted between houses with the kind of restless excitement only teenagers can summon, visiting friends, laughing about the future, making promises they could never keep. Their last stop was at the Kirby residence, where their friend Janelle had planned to host them for the night. But the house was overcrowded with relatives, the air thick and loud, and Susie wanted to show off her new waterbed back home. So, around 2 a.m., the two girls slipped away, whispering about how they would meet their friends the next morning for the water park trip. Stacy promising her mother she would call. It should have been nothing, a short drive, a quiet night's rest, a summer morning waiting to unfold. But the journey to East Delmar Street was the point of no return. When the sun rose hours later, their cars would be sitting outside untouched, their purses stacked inside, but the girls themselves nowhere to be found. And Cheryl, always punctual, always reliable, would not answer her phone, would not show up to her appointments, as if the ground had swallowed her whole. The first to notice was Janelle Kirby, expecting the girls to return to her house that morning. Instead, she found only silence. She and her boyfriend went to check on the Delmar house. The door was unlocked, the dog agitated, the porch light shattered, glass scattered across the steps like some kind of silent warning. Inside, nothing was out of place, and yet everything was wrong. The house radiated absence, a tension so thick that even the smallest details became ominous. The television in Susie's room buzzed with static, her cigarettes left untouched, the makeup and jewelry laid out neatly as if they had been preparing for bed. It looked as if 3 lives had been interrupted mid-sentence, as if someone had simply erased them from the frame of their own story. And in that empty house, there was a darkness that could not be explained, a sense that the walls themselves remembered something terrible. When Janelle and her boyfriend first stepped inside the Delmar house, they felt it instantly: something unnatural, something wrong. The house wasn't ransacked. There were no screams, no overturned furniture. It was the silence itself that cut like a knife. The girls' purses were lined neatly in the living room. Stacy's car still sat parked outside, her keys inside. Susie's brand new Miata, her graduation gift, gleamed in the driveway, untouched. People don't just walk away from their lives like that. And then came the calls. First, Janelle's boyfriend answered the phone. A man's voice on the other end, low, heavy with something obscene. He described sexual acts in a tone so casual it made Janelle's skin crawl. He hung up, then called again. Another vile message, they thought. It was a prank, some sick joke aimed at teenage girls. But later, investigators would admit that those calls may have been the only real clue they had, and the answering machine tape that once held the messages. Erased, gone, whether by accident, negligence, or someone's deliberate hand, no one can say. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar van parked outside in the early hours of the morning. But by the time police took the report, the street had been cleaned of evidence. Within hours, the Delmar house had become a carnival of contamination. Family members, friends, curious onlookers, all walking through, touching doorknobs, smoking cigarettes, even cleaning up shattered glass on the porch light without realizing it might have been the killer's doing. Every footprint, every fingerprint that might have mattered was buried under dozens more. A crime scene turned into a living room gathering, and by the time law enforcement truly realized the magnitude of what had happened, that 3 women had vanished without a sound. Everything was already ruined. What remained was only the residue of something unspeakable. A silence so heavy that even decades later, it hangs over Springfield like a curse. By dawn, the story had spread like wildfire. 3 women gone, without warning, without sound. The first whispers were ordinary enough. Maybe they'd run off to Branson for the weekend. Maybe they were hiding at a friend's house. But by the second day, those whispers twisted into something darker. Parents locked their doors for the first time in years. Teenagers who once roamed the streets until midnight were suddenly being driven home before sunset. The police, grasping at straws, released a composite sketch of a suspicious van seen prowling the Del Mar neighborhood that night. A green Dodge, dented on one side. For weeks afterward, every van in Missouri became a phantom. Neighbors reported them parked outside grocery stores, following school buses, idling at intersections. Each sighting sent detectives on a chase that always ended in nothing. And the theories were endless. Some swore it was a drifter, someone passing through who saw opportunity and took it. Others pointed to someone closer, an ex-boyfriend, a jealous rival, a man who'd been obsessed with one of the women. Rumors said Stacy's older boyfriend was furious about her leaving him behind for college, that Susie had been testifying against a dangerous criminal, that Cheryl, the mother, had debts or secrets no one in the community knew about. And beneath it all, the town began turning on itself. Suspicion poisoned conversations. Friends looked at friends with unease. Husbands eyed wives. Neighbors kept curtains drawn. Everyone wanted an answer. No one had one. The police clung to the idea that the women had been taken by someone they knew, that the abduction was surgical, fast, designed to leave no trace. But others whispered of something else, something larger, something that suggested the Springfield 3 hadn't just been kidnapped. They had been erased. By the 3rd week, Springfield was suffocating under its own silence. The flyers were everywhere, taped to streetlights, pinned to grocery store boards, slipped under windshields in church parking lots. 3 smiling faces, staring back at a town that could no longer smile. But behind the scenes, the investigation was shifting. Detectives were quietly expanding their net, moving beyond the familiar streets of Del Mar and into the underbelly of southwest Missouri. A name began circulating in hushed tones. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper, a man who had once brutally attacked a woman in Florida, leaving her for dead. At the time of the disappearance, Cox was living in Springfield, working as a utilities technician, blending in like a ghost among ordinary men. He denied any involvement, claimed he had been with his girlfriend the night of June 7th. But when pressed, years later, his girlfriend admitted she had lied to protect him. Cox was cold, detached, almost amused when reporters asked if he knew where the women were. "They're not alive," he said flatly, "and they'll never be found." That one sentence chilled Springfield to its bones. Yet, despite the weight of suspicion, police had nothing concrete to hold him. No DNA, no physical evidence. Just words that dangled like a curse over the city. Other suspects surfaced, a pair of convicted criminals who had broken into graves. A trucker passing through who bragged in bars about moving bodies. Each lead burned hot, then turned to ash. And with every dead end, the town's patience fractured further. People began to whisper that the police knew more than they were saying, that the case was being buried intentionally, that someone powerful didn't want the truth dragged into the light. What had started as an ordinary summer abduction now stank of something larger, something that reached past the borders of Springfield, Missouri, into the murky world of secrets no one dared put on record. By July, Springfield's trust had withered into suspicion. People no longer asked if the women would be found, but rather why no one in power seemed capable of finding them. Theories multiplied like weeds. Some whispered that the women had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see in operation, tucked into the shadows of the Ozarks, protected by men whose hands never touched paperwork. Others claimed law enforcement itself was compromised. It wasn't hard to believe. Reports of mishandled evidence crept into the open. A green Dodge van seen near the house had been spotted by neighbors, yet it vanished from the record as though it had never existed. Crucial hours in the investigation were wasted while the house was trampled by family, friends, and well-meaning neighbors, contaminating the crime scene beyond repair. Was this incompetence or design? By the time the FBI offered its assistance, the Springfield police bristled, reluctant to hand control of the case to outsiders. Territorial pride, they said, but the public heard something darker: secrecy. When Robert Craig Cox made his chilling statement years later, many believed he wasn't boasting. He was warning, suggesting that someone, somewhere, had tied the city's hands. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone to school. Porch lights burned through the night. Conversations in diners grew sharper, filled with an edge of paranoia. The mystery wasn't just about 3 missing women. Anymore, it was about what kind of machinery was grinding beneath the surface of Springfield. Machinery that could make 3 lives vanish without a trace, then leave the town itself trapped in silence by midsummer. The case had stopped feeling like a police matter and started feeling like a shadow that owned the town. Springfield wasn't just searching anymore, it was haunted. People began to speak of the missing women in hushed tones, as though even saying their names might draw misfortune closer. A waitress at a diner swore she saw one of the women's faces in the reflection of a window just before the glass cracked. A farmer claimed his cattle refused to drink from a creek the morning after police dragged it for bodies. Rational minds dismissed these stories, but the mood was undeniable. The case had taken on the weight of a curse. Reporters from across the country swarmed Springfield, their vans clogging Main Street, their questions sharpening the unease. They weren't here to help, they were here to feast on tragedy. Each headline reminded the locals of what they had lost, and yet provided nothing in return. Meanwhile, the police department's silence grew louder than any words. Leads went cold, suspects slipped away, and behind closed doors, neighbors whispered, "What if we're not supposed to know the truth?" Some believed organized crime was involved. Others muttered about hidden networks that reached into government offices, into the courts, maybe even into the force itself. The fear shifted from will they ever be found to what happens if we uncover what really happened. Springfield was no longer a town with a mystery, it was a town under a spell. The families of the missing women became the unwilling center of Springfield's slow unraveling. And it did not take long before grief curdled into suspicion. At first, they stood united, appearing together at vigils, clasping each other's hands in front of cameras, and offering shared statements that pleaded for answers. But unity is fragile under pressure, and Springfield had become a furnace of speculation, rumor, and whispered blame. Some whispered that one of the fathers had a gambling debt that might have entangled his daughter in something she never should have been near. Others muttered that one mother's sudden silence, her refusal to speak publicly after the first few weeks, proved she knew more than she was willing to admit. The town, already fractured by fear, began to pry at every seam in their lives. Old rivalries surfaced, arguments from years earlier about property lines, inheritance disputes, or petty jealousies between families who had once pretended to be friends. Now, every word, every glance, every silence carried new meaning. The pressure turned inward as well. Inside their homes, the families argued relentlessly, picking apart each decision made before the disappearances, replaying their last conversations with their daughters like evidence in a courtroom. A brother accused his mother of being too controlling, of driving his sister to secret rebellion. A father turned cold toward his wife, resenting her for insisting their daughter go out that night when he had wanted her home. Grief has its own twisted logic, and it did not take long for guilt to become a weapon. Even at the prayer circles, where neighbors gathered to light candles, there were eyes that lingered too long on certain families, as though one of them had orchestrated it all, as though tragedy could never be random, but had to come from within. Rumors seeped into every corner, that the women had run away, that they had joined a cult, that their families had arranged for their disappearance to cover up something darker. The truth was no longer required only. The suggestion of it was enough to poison relationships. In this way, the families who had once anchored Springfield's identity found themselves unraveling, under the same curse that had stolen their daughters, as if the mystery itself demanded not only victims, but the slow destruction of everyone left behind. By the time autumn settled over Springfield, the case had grown into something grotesque, a spectacle that drew people not out of compassion, but out of hunger for tragedy. Vigils were no longer solemn gatherings of prayer and mourning. They became performances, staged beneath the watchful eyes of television cameras. Candles flickered in the night air, but the words spoken felt rehearsed, hollow, drained of the intimacy they once held. People came dressed not in quiet sorrow, but in clothes chosen to be seen, to be photographed, to become part of the story itself. Outsiders arrived from neighboring towns, then from other states, claiming to be psychics, visionaries, or amateur detectives. Some declared they felt the energy of the missing women on certain streets, while others claimed visions of shallow graves in the woods. The police entertained none of it publicly, but privately. Officers admitted the noise was overwhelming, clouding any chance of clarity. Springfield's streets became crowded with strangers who had no connection to the women, yet spoke as though the mystery belonged to them. Local businesses quietly profited, selling shirts with the women's faces, bumper stickers, and bracelets stamped with their names. It was grief transformed into an economy, and not everyone was ashamed to admit it. For the residents who had lived their entire lives in Springfield, it felt like their town had been stolen, reshaped into a stage for outsiders, a place where pain had been converted into entertainment. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, not just for potential guilt, but for motives of profit, wondering who might be exploiting the tragedy under the guise of solidarity. This was no longer about three women. It was about Springfield itself. A town transformed into an open wound, a cursed landmark in the eyes of the nation. Even the churches, once seen as sanctuaries, became divided. Sermons spoke of demons, of punishment, of divine justice for hidden sins. Parishioners nodded, some whispering that the disappearances were not a crime at all, but retribution. Whether people believed in God or not, they believed in something darker, that the town had been chosen, marked, set apart for suffering. And the spectacle only deepened the sense that the missing women were never meant to be found, that their absence was the point, that their silence had become the town's new, unshakable identity. As weeks turned into months, Springfield began to feel less like a town and more like a stage set for something sinister, populated by outsiders who seemed drawn to the darkness itself. People arrived in vans, in pickup trucks, some claiming to be amateur investigators, others insisting they had psychic visions, all convinced they could solve what the police could not. Their methods were reckless, their presence invasive, and their obsession infectious. Neighborhoods once quiet and familiar felt violated as strangers prowled the streets, knocking on doors, photographing lawns, following children to school, and lingering outside the homes of families already shattered by grief. Some outsiders whispered about sacrificial patterns, about the timing of the disappearances in relation to ancient calendars, about invisible networks that moved beneath Springfield streets. Others claimed they could communicate with the missing women, offering messages from some liminal place that only they could access. The police were overwhelmed, trying to separate fact from delusion. Yet every report had to be taken seriously until it was proven false. Residents, already frayed from anxiety, began reporting strange phenomena: footsteps in empty houses, flickering lights in rooms where no one stood, shadows in alleyways that vanished when approached. Some feared the outsiders themselves, believing they were not here to help, but to feed on the fear, to learn which doors could be opened, which secrets could be pried loose. And the media descended, amplifying every rumor, broadcasting the town's unease to viewers nationwide, twisting Springfield into a symbol of terror, a cautionary tale, a place where innocence had been obliterated. The original crime, their disappearance of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, was now overshadowed by a secondary horror. The town itself had become a magnet for chaos, a living entity that seemed to feed on speculation, paranoia, and sorrow. Locals spoke of the missing women not as people, but as ghosts, their names conjuring unease and dread, their faces haunting advertisements for vigils, websites, and televised specials. Some wondered if the women were alive, trapped somewhere beyond comprehension, or if they had been silenced forever by forces no one could name. Others suspected that the outsiders, those who claimed to know more than the authorities, were closer to the truth than anyone wanted to admit. Springfield had become a hunting ground, not for the missing women, but for the truth itself, a truth buried beneath layers of grief, obsession, and fear, visible only to those willing to follow it into shadows no light had yet penetrated. As the investigation deepened, the unsettling truth began to emerge. The danger had not come from the shadows of the highways or the forests outside. Springfield, it had been living among them all along. Early on, suspicion fell on Dustin Reckler, Susie Streeter's former boyfriend, a man with a criminal record and a history of grave-breaking that made him the embodiment of a predator hiding in plain sight. He had stolen gold fillings from a mausoleum months before the disappearances, and rumors swirled that Susie might have been called as a witness against him. Reckler's presence in the area that night could not be fully verified, yet his connection to Susie was enough to make him a figure of intense scrutiny. Beyond him, more sinister possibilities emerged. Larry Dwayne Hall, a man whose name would chill investigators for decades, had been traveling the Midwest for historical reenactments of Civil War battles, perfectly blending into the community, while allegedly abducting and murdering women across state lines. Hall's patterns matched the timing of the disappearances, the precision and coldness of the acts suggesting a mind capable of erasing people without leaving evidence. A mind that may have been in Springfield when Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl vanished. Then there was Robert Craig Cox, the convicted kidnapper and robber who years later would claim, with disconcerting nonchalance, that he knew the women were dead and would never be found. Police investigated, confirmed alibis, but the words themselves were like a poison. Someone who could commit such acts had existed in the same city, and whether or not he had done it, his knowledge hinted at networks, accomplices, or a world of hidden violence that ordinary citizens could scarcely imagine. And yet, even these men were only pieces of a larger, darker puzzle. Gerald Carnahan, tied to previous brutal crimes, and others connected to outlaw motorcycle gangs and violent criminal networks, surfaced in whispers and tip lines. Each revelation deepened the sense that Springfield was a town surrounded by predators, some disguised as neighbors, others as friends, others still invisible entirely. The families, the friends, the police, they were all participants in a nightmare where every face could hide a threat, where every handshake might conceal a hand that could destroy life and erase existence. By the time the authorities began to compile their suspect lists, the town understood a terrifying reality. Evil had not arrived with the missing women, it had already been there, waiting, watching, blending into the mundane, and it had claimed 3 lives without a sound, without warning, leaving a void that no investigation could easily fill. The Delmar residence, the site of the disappearances, became a silent witness to a nightmare compounded by human error. When police first arrived, the scene had already been altered, contaminated by the very people who loved the women, those desperate to help but unaware they were destroying the only clues that might have revealed the truth. Friends and neighbors had entered the house, walked through the rooms, handled objects without gloves, moved ashtrays, swept broken glass from the shattered porch lamp, and even touched the family dog, Cinnamon, who had witnessed the terror unfold. By the time investigators began cataloging evidence, they realized the scene had been compromised beyond repair. Streeter's car was not in its usual position in the driveway, a detail that suggested someone else had been there before the women. Arrived a chilling possibility that haunted detectives. Inside, the women's belongings remained, yet every object told a fragmented story. Purses were untouched, money remained in Levitt's wallet, keys were where they should be, clothes folded neatly. Makeup wipes indicated the girls had prepared for bed. Cigarettes left burning, and a can of Coke unfinished on the nightstand. These details were almost too precise, suggesting a sudden interruption. Someone had entered, taken control, and removed the women without disturbing the routine of their home. Perhaps the most haunting element was the answering machine, the single device that might have held a voice capable of unraveling the mystery. A message, strange and possibly connected to the disappearance, had been inadvertently erased after being played. The tape that could have held the final words or threats, the voice of the abductor, vanished into thin air. The shattered porch light, the only apparent sign of struggle, remained a single, cold clue. Its broken glass hinted at a sudden confrontation or a forced entry, but without fingerprints or other trace evidence, the meaning remained elusive. Even the family dog's behavior, a frantic, distressed reaction, offered no explanation to outsiders, only a suggestion that something violent and unnatural had occurred. Every mistake, every interference by well-meaning civilians compounded the darkness of the case, ensuring that the investigation would proceed with ghostly fragments rather than facts. Springfield had not simply lost 3 women. It had lost the ability to reconstruct the moment they vanished, leaving behind only a tableau of normalcy violently interrupted. A house that held memories, possessions, and a single unanswered question. what happened here. In the dead hours of June 7th, 1992, that allowed 3 lives to vanish without a trace, leaving nothing but shadows, shattered glass, and the quiet, piercing emptiness of a town unable to comprehend the depth of the crime. From the very beginning, the search for Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl was plagued not only by the shadows of real danger, but by the illusions of false hope. Springfield streets became a theater of rumors, anonymous tips, and dead-end leads, each one amplifying the town's anxiety while simultaneously derailing the investigation. Calls flooded in from people claiming to have seen the women in neighboring towns, at motels, even hitchhiking along deserted highways. But every sighting dissolved under scrutiny, leaving only disappointment and suspicion. Some tips were darker, intentionally misleading hoaxes, designed to manipulate the authorities, to insert chaos into an already fragile investigation. One anonymous caller to the America's Most Wanted hotline claimed to possess prime knowledge of the abductions, but the line disconnected before the tip could be properly logged. The individual never followed up, leaving police with only the unsettling certainty that someone had been close to the truth and had intentionally withheld it. Other tips suggested the women had been buried beneath concrete, inside structures, or parking garages, but further investigation proved these claims impossible. Like whispers of death echoing from a phantom landscape, each false lead was a blade against the psyche of the town, a demonstration that the mystery was not confined to what was real, but extended into what was imagined, feared, and deliberately fabricated. Residents became trapped in a cycle of hope and despair, chasing shadows and second-guessing every familiar face. Family members and friends who had once clung to procedural progress now wrestled with paranoia. Could a neighbor, a co-worker, or even a family friend have been involved? The relentless uncertainty ate away at trust, corroding relationships, and the town itself began to feel like a maze with no exit. Detectives, meanwhile, had to sift through thousands of tips, balancing public pressure with the rigor of evidence. And yet the weight of the impossible task was palpable. Every false lead not only delayed the Pan's investigation, but deepened the sense that the women's fate was being hidden by forces beyond comprehension, whether by criminals manipulating attention, or by the very machinery of small-town bureaucracy. Springfield had become a city of ghosts and whispers, where reality and fiction collided in a fog that refused to lift, leaving the people to live in suspended terror, wondering if the missing women were already gone forever, or if some unknown hand was orchestrating their disappearance in plain sight, taunting the town with every unsubstantiated rumor, every hoax tip, every fractured clue that led nowhere but deeper into the darkness of unanswered questions. The burden of the case did not weigh solely on the families or the town. It settled like a shadow over the shoulders of the men and women tasked with uncovering the truth. Detectives, once confident in the rules of procedure, found themselves haunted by the impossibility of the crime. Every day they returned to the Delmar residence, or reviewed a tip, or re-examined the shattered porch lamp. They felt the case pressing into their minds, a slow, corrosive anxiety that refused to loosen its grip. Some officers began to question their own judgment, replaying every decision, every lead they had pursued or ignored, imagining that some subtle misstep had condemned the women to disappear forever. Others found themselves watching the town as though it were a crime scene itself, suspicious of every neighbor, every passerby, convinced that evil was walking openly among them. The layers of the mystery broken glass, erased answering machine messages, contaminated evidence, conflicting witness statements, and thousands of misleading tips conspired to strip away confidence and replace it with annoying paranoia. Even those who prided themselves on experience felt fear intruding into their instincts, whispering that no one could be trusted, that every familiar face might conceal a predator. The pressure was relentless. Some investigators began visiting the site late at night, alone, drawn by the idea that the missing women's presence lingered in the air, a residual trace of horror that could only be perceived by those willing to risk their own sanity. Others pored over maps, suspect files, and timelines in obsessive cycles, sleeping only a few hours a night, haunted by imagined confrontations and endless what-ifs. Coffee cups stacked in the corner of precinct offices, notes scrawled. Across whiteboards, photographs taped to walls, the office itself transformed into a war room, a shrine to uncertainty, a place where reality blurred with conjecture. Relationships frayed, marriages strained, personal health declined, and yet the investigators could not step away. The thought of leaving the case unresolved was more terrifying than exhaustion or disease. Each interview, each anonymous call, each rumor renewed their compulsion, binding them ever tighter to the invisible thread connecting the missing women to forces the town could not comprehend. In those long nights of relentless pursuit, the detectives themselves became part of Springfield's haunted landscape, figures moving through shadow and silence, driven by a knowledge that the answers they sought might expose truths far more dangerous than anyone was ready to face. The case was no longer just a mystery. It was an incubator of obsession, and those who entered it would never leave untouched, carrying its darkness like a wound that refused to heal. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that Springfield was not an isolated tragedy, but a node in a disturbing web stretching far beyond the town's borders. Reports emerged of other young women vanishing in surrounding counties, each case eerily similar: sudden disappearances, personal belongings left behind, no signs of struggle, and an unsettling sense that the victims had been plucked from ordinary life with surgical precision. Patterns began to form: disappearances clustered in months, coinciding with regional events, fairs, and reenactments that drew crowds and masked the movements of those who preyed in plain sight. Some of the missing had attended graduation parties, just like Susie and Stacy, or had been last seen in the company of close friends or family, a striking parallel that chilled investigators to the core. As the list of cases grew, experts began to consider the terrifying possibility of an organized network, a group operating with meticulous planning, exploiting the predictable rhythms of small-town life to select and remove victims while leaving behind only fragmented traces, like whispers burned into memory. The public, already on edge, began to perceive Springfield not merely as a town with 3 missing women, but as the epicenter of something larger, more sinister, a gateway into a hidden system of violence that authorities were struggling to comprehend. Online forums and media reports began drawing lines between cases, speculating about serial offenders who traveled undercover, blending into towns for weeks or months before vanishing, leaving only the echo of absence. Some suggested a connection to outlaw motorcycle gangs, others to itinerant criminals using historical reenactments and public events to camouflage their movements. Even the police began to feel the weight of the unseen, the idea that they were not merely investigating 3 missing women, but trying to penetrate a shadow network designed to frustrate discovery, to erase its presence while marking its victims. Families of other disappearances reached out, offering fragmented testimonies, sightings, and tips, but the information was inconsistent, unreliable, tainted by grief and hope alike. Yet every new story reinforced the central horror. These were not random events, but deliberate extractions of life, coordinated and invisible, leaving communities paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Springfield, once a typical Midwestern town, now existed as a symbol, a warning. Ordinary life could be infiltrated by extraordinary evil, and the same forces that claimed Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl might have been watching, waiting, moving undetected, ready to strike anywhere in this seemingly safe, yet profoundly vulnerable, region. In the days following the disappearances, one element of the case became both a tantalizing clue and a source of frustration: the technology of the era, primitive yet capable of obscuring truth, offered glimpses of the unknown but ensured that no certainty could ever be reached. The answering machine, a simple device meant to catch messages in the absence of the household, became a vault of unspoken secrets. When Janice McCall and Janelle Kirby checked the machine, they discovered a message of such strange and disturbing nature that investigators later identified it as potentially critical. Yet it was erased almost instantly after being played, as was standard with most tapes of the time. What was said? Who had called? The message became a phantom, a specter of knowledge that no one could recover, leaving a void in the investigation that would be felt for decades. Compounding this were the obscene and persistent prank calls that had harassed the Streeter household. For weeks prior, a teenish voice, crude, suggestive, and mocking, had made repeated advances into their privacy, a taunting rhythm of intrusion that blurred the line between harmless annoyance and threat. Police later surmised that these calls may have been unrelated, but the psychological impact was profound. The women, already navigating the complex transition from teenage freedom to adult responsibility, had lived under a subtle but constant surveillance, a reminder that someone was listening, watching, and willing to breach boundaries with ease. The primitive nature of 1990s technology, with its limited logging capabilities, analog tapes, and delayed communication channels, ensured that any evidence captured electronically was fragile, ephemeral, and easily lost. Investigators could only reconstruct fragments from memory, witness testimony, and sporadic phone records. Yet the gaps themselves told a story. A network of unseen observers had interacted with the household in a way that technology could record, but not preserve. Each unanswered call, each erased message, became a cipher, a puzzle with pieces deliberately withheld by circumstance or design. The Streeter home, once a sanctuary, became an archive of absence, each object and sound holding a latent meaning, invisible to all but the perpetrator. And the unanswered message on that machine, ephemeral and ghost-like, became emblematic of the entire Kaiser, warning that knowledge exists, but access to it is fleeting, that danger can communicate with you without leaving a trace, and that sometimes the most critical evidence is not what is found, but what is lost forever, leaving the town, the investigators, and the families haunted by silence as impenetrable as the night in which the women vanished. As the investigation trudged forward, a new layer of darkness emerged, not from the streets or hidden corners of Springfield, but from the very human tendency toward deception. Statements, confessions, and tips arrived from individuals who promised knowledge yet delivered only contradictions, half-truths, or outright lies. Among the most chilling was Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and robber who, years later, casually declared to journalists that he knew the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be recovered. The authorities, weighing his credibility, found his alibis corroborated by family and associates, yet his calm assertion lingered like a shadow over the case, a suggestion that someone, somewhere, held absolute knowledge and was choosing to withhold it. Similarly, Gerald Carnahan, connected to previous murders, came under scrutiny for his proximity and criminal ties. Statements from witnesses associated with him were inconsistent. Some recanted under pressure, others remained intentionally vague. The result was a tangled web of potential truths, each thread threatening to collapse under the weight of doubt. Police found themselves navigating a labyrinth of misinformation, where even the smallest detail could be a trap or a guide. The human element became a weapon as much as the perpetrators themselves. Friends who misremembered sequences of events, neighbors who embellished sightings, and informants who claimed visions or psychic insights. Each layer of deception forced investigators to question not only what was real, but whether reality itself could be trusted. Within the town, paranoia grew, fueled by media sensationalism and public speculation. People began to interpret ordinary behavior as suspicious, minor coincidences as sinister signs, and casual interactions as coded messages. The women's disappearance became a canvas on which every observer painted their fears, prejudices, and obsessions. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on law enforcement intensified. Officers began doubting not only the credibility of witnesses, but the reliability of their own instincts, haunted by the idea that somewhere a witness or even a suspect knew exactly what had happened and reveled in their silence. The intersection of human deception, criminal calculation, and societal anxiety transformed Springfield from a town into a psychological battlefield, where truth was elusive, trust was a liability, and every revelation carried the weight of potential betrayal. In this climate, the line between victim, perpetrator, and observer blurred, leaving investigators, families, and the entire community trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty, convinced that the missing women's fate was both knowable and forever obscured, a secret held tight by those willing to manipulate reality for reasons no one could fathom. As investigators charted the movements of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl on that fateful night, a disturbing pattern began to crystallize, a pattern that suggested this was not random, but orchestrated with deliberate precision. Every choice, every location, every shift in plans that night became a potential variable in a carefully constructed sequence. The graduation parties, the drive to the Kirby residence, the aborted trip to Branson, and the final decision to retreat to Levitt's home appeared, at first glance, mundane. Yet, in the context of disappearance, they revealed a landscape of vulnerability exploited by someone who had been observing, calculating, and waiting. Investigators noted the timing. Parties scattered across Springfield and Battlefield roads, with minimal traffic during the pre-dawn hours, familiar routes that offered both predictability and isolation. The broken porch light at the Delmar residence was no random damage. It was either a mark of forced entry or a deliberate signal left in a place that everyone assumed was safe, yet no one could now prove. Witness statements, inconsistent as they were, hinted at the possibility that someone had followed the girls or been waiting, exploiting the ordinary human need for familiarity and routine. Even the presence of the family dog, Cinnamon, became a vector of insight. Her agitation suggested immediate threat, yet she had no way to signal the world beyond the house. The pattern extended beyond the immediate geography. Regional incidents of abduction and unsolved murders suggested an itinerant predator moving along predictable circuits. blending into town events, using schedules, local festivities, and routine behavior as camouflage. Investigators began mapping not only streets and homes, but also time itself, suspecting that the hours between midnight and dawn were chosen deliberately, a window where supervision was minimal and the world's attention was elsewhere. Every abandoned purse, every untouched wallet, every item left in meticulous order within the house reinforced the idea that the women had been taken with clinical intent, not impulsive violence. The invisible hand that orchestrated their disappearance seemed to understand human behavior with unnerving clarity, where friends would look first, where investigators would focus, even what would be left to taunt those searching for answers. Springfield, in the context of this pattern, was transformed from a safe, predictable environment into a chessboard. Every move preempted by someone operating with an intelligence designed to exploit, conceal, and erase. The women's disappearance was not merely a tragedy, it was a demonstration of calculated mastery over space, time, and human expectation, a silent assertion that the unseen could dictate reality, manipulate perception, and vanish into the ordinary night, leaving only questions that would haunt the town and those who dared to chase truth forever. As word of the disappearances spread, the story leapt from the confines of Springfield into regional and national consciousness, carried on the wings of anxious journalists and sensational headlines. Newspapers published photographs of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, each image frozen in a moment of ordinary life, now transformed into symbols of fear and loss. Television reporters visited the town, their cameras capturing vacant streets, concerned neighbors, and the haunted expressions of family members who were struggling to reconcile hope with terror. The public's imagination, once indifferent to small-town rhythms, became entwined with every fragment of information, every rumor, every unverified tip. Citizens began speculating in coffee shops, on front porches, in grocery store aisles, weaving theories that ranged from plausible to fantastical. The media, hungry for viewers and readership, amplified these whispers, often without verification, and in doing so blurred the line between fact and fear. Talk shows dissected the girls' social lives, highlighting parties and friendships, subtly implying that youthful choices somehow made them targets, while investigative segments highlighted the broken porch light, the untouched purses, and the erased message on the answering machine as eerie markers of something sinister beyond comprehension. Each broadcast, each column, acted as a lens through which the town and eventually the nation viewed Springfield, projecting the missing women into a narrative of horror, suspense, and moral caution. Families in surrounding counties began to draw connections to their own fears, revisiting past disappearances, and wondering if the unseen predator could strike anywhere that routines were predictable and innocence unsuspecting. The cumulative effect was psychological. The town's normalcy fractured under the weight of attention. Every neighbor suspicious, every car in the driveway a potential threat, every sound in the night a possible signal of danger. Investigators faced a new challenge. The media-driven fear complicated witness testimony, emboldened false leads, and intensified the pressure to resolve a case that was, in many ways, beyond resolution. Yet even amidst the noise, one truth became unmistakable. The story had taken on a life of its own, a living entity that fed on uncertainty and dread, growing larger with each retelling, each theory, each broadcast segment. Springfield itself became a character in the unfolding horror, a town caught between its past and an unknowable present. its streets haunted by absence, its people bound by collective anxiety, and its reputation indelibly marked by a crime that refused to yield answers, leaving behind only questions, suspicion, and the pervasive certainty that something in the night had claimed 3 women and turned a simple Midwestern town into a cautionary tale of darkness, lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary life. As the investigation deepened, attention inevitably turned to those who had loomed at the edges of the girls' lives, men whose pasts and behaviors cast long shadows over the case. Dustin Reckler, a former boyfriend of Susie Streeter, immediately drew scrutiny. Known for a previous break-in at a local mausoleum, during which he and accomplices had stolen gold fillings from a skull, Reckler had the capacity for calculated criminal acts. Police noted that Streeter had been poised to testify against him in court, suggesting a motive rooted in fear, revenge, or silencing. The night of the disappearance, Reckler and his friends were reportedly in the area, their proximity unnervingly close, though no concrete evidence linked them directly to the abductions. Then there was Larry Dwayne Hall, a serial predator with a chilling history. Hall traveled across the Midwest, moving under the guise of historical reenactments, leaving a trail of victims that matched a pattern: young women abducted during months corresponding to public events, often vanishing without trace. He spoke of his crimes in explicit detail to FBI operatives, revealing a level of obsession and control that suggested he could meticulously plan a disappearance with frightening precision. The fact that Hall had conducted reenactments near Springfield, in both Wilson's Creek and Pleasant Hope, created a geographic overlap too precise to ignore. Gerald Carnahan, later convicted of the rape and murder of Jackie Johns, also emerged as a figure of interest. His criminal record included prior abductions, and connections to outlaw motorcycle gangs hinted at a network capable of facilitating violent acts while avoiding detection. Even peripheral associations, like Stephen Garrison, a gang member and convicted rapist, provided fragments of leads, yet nothing coalesced into actionable proof. Then there was Robert Craig Cox, imprisoned yet vocal, claiming to know the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be found. While authorities largely dismissed Cox as seeking attention, the content of his claims was precise enough to be unsettling, leaving investigators to wrestle with the psychological weight of a man professing forbidden knowledge, a darkness he promised to reveal only after his mother's death. Each suspect, each potential accomplice, presented a double reality, a person whose proximity to the victims could not be ignored, and a possibility that the truth would remain forever just out of reach. The web of criminal histories, geographic movements, and tenuous connections painted a terrifying tableau of what might have occurred that night. It suggested a convergence of intent, opportunity, and malevolent skill, leaving Springfield not just with unanswered questions, but with the haunting certainty that those responsible may have walked openly among them, watching, calculating, and leaving no trace but absence. As the investigation deepened, attention inevitably turned to those who had loomed at the edges of the girls' lives, men whose pasts and behaviors cast long shadows over the case. Dustin Reckler, a former boyfriend of Susie Streeter, immediately drew scrutiny. Known for a previous break-in at a local mausoleum, during which he and accomplices had stolen gold fillings from a skull, Reckler had the capacity for calculated criminal acts. Police noted that Streeter had been poised to testify against him in court, suggesting a motive rooted in fear, revenge, or silencing. The night of the disappearance, Reckler and his friends were reportedly in the area. Their proximity unnervingly close, though no concrete evidence linked them directly to the abductions. Then there was Larry Dwayne Hall, a serial predator with a chilling history. Hall traveled across the Midwest, moving under the guise of historical reenactments, leaving a trail of victims that matched a pattern: young women, abducted during months corresponding to public events, often vanishing without trace. He spoke of his crimes in explicit detail to FBI operatives, revealing a level of obsession and control that suggested he could meticulously plan a disappearance with frightening precision. The fact that Hall had conducted reenactments near Springfield, in both Wilson's Creek and Pleasant Hope, created a geographic overlap too precise to ignore. Gerald Carnahan, later convicted of the rape and murder of Jackie Johns, also emerged as a figure of interest. His criminal record included prior abductions and connections to outlaw motorcycle gangs, hinted at a network capable of facilitating violent acts while avoiding detection. Even peripheral associations, like Stephen Garrison, a gang member and convicted rapist, provided fragments of leads, yet nothing coalesced into actionable proof. Then there was Robert Craig Cox, imprisoned yet vocal, claiming to know the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be found. While authorities largely dismissed Cox as seeking attention, the content of his claims was precise, enough to be unsettling, leaving investigators to wrestle with the psychological weight of a man professing forbidden knowledge, a darkness he promised to reveal only after his mother's death. Each suspect, each potential accomplice, presented a double reality, a person whose proximity to the victims could not be ignored, and a possibility that the truth would remain forever just out of reach. The web of criminal histories, geographic movements, and tenuous connections painted a terrifying tableau of what might have occurred that night. It suggested a convergence of intent, opportunity, and malevolent skill, leaving Springfield not just with unanswered questions, but with the haunting certainty that those responsible may have walked openly among them, watching, calculating, and leaving no trace but absence. The crime scene at the Delmar residence, seemingly ordinary, became a battlefield between chance, human error, and forensic opportunity. When investigators arrived, they found the house already compromised: friends, neighbors, and even Janelle. Kirby's boyfriend had entered, swept broken glass from the porch, moved objects, and unwittingly erased potential clues. Every footprint, every displaced item, every fingerprint lost to cleaning or casual curiosity added layers of ambiguity to an already complex puzzle. Forensic experts recognized the challenge immediately. The absence of overt struggle meant that any traces of abduction DNA, hair fibers, latent fingerprints would be minimal to begin with, and the intrusion of dozens of civilians transformed what might have been recoverable evidence into an ephemeral memory, something that could only be imagined, reconstructed from what remained. The shattered porch light, initially perceived as a sign of forced entry, became a symbol of uncertainty. Was it damaged during the abduction, or was it incidental? Could it have been a signal left intentionally, or merely a coincidental accident? Inside, the scene offered its own cryptic messages: purses untouched, money left behind, a pack of cigarettes and an unfinished Coke on Susie Streeter's bed, clothing folded, jewelry in place, and the family dog in distress, yet confined to the domestic space. Forensic teams attempted to piece together timelines and movement patterns, yet the contamination made conclusions tenuous, forcing reliance on circumstantial evidence and witness recollection. Compounding this was the technology of the era 1992s. Analog phone systems, answering machines, and paper-based record-keeping offered fleeting traces of activity, messages that could not be recovered after a single play. Investigators could not rely on electronic logs to verify sequences of calls, making it impossible to reconstruct every interaction before or during the disappearance. Each misstep, whether the innocent act of sweeping glass or the erasure of a tape message, became a permanent obstruction, a locked door that could never be reopened. Experts recognized that once evidence is lost in such a precise, quiet crime, the probability of full resolution diminishes exponentially. The Delmar residence itself transformed into a haunted site, a space that had absorbed the last moments of the missing women yet offered no coherent testimony. The house spoke only in absence, its clues fragmented, obscured, and contaminated by well-meaning intervention. Investigators were left to navigate a forensic landscape where the evidence that could have delivered justice was irretrievably scattered, leaving the trajectory of the night, the path of the abduction, and the identity of the perpetrator shrouded in uncertainty. Every uncollected fiber, every disrupted fingerprint, every erased message became a reminder that in crimes of calculated precision, even small errors conceal the fate of truth, leaving communities, families, and law enforcement trapped in a darkness they cannot illuminate. For the families of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, the disappearance was not merely a criminal investigation, became a psychological siege, a slow, corrosive erosion of certainty and safety. Each day stretched into a new trial of hope and despair, the boundaries between reality and fear dissolving under the weight of unanswered questions. Janice McCall, desperate for any sign of her daughter, checked phones, cars, and closets repeatedly, as if routine could summon answers from the void. Cheryl Levitt's friends and relatives struggled with the same gnawing doubt. Had she left willingly, or had something far darker taken place? Nights were the cruelest, filled with imagined sounds and fleeting shadows, where every creak of the house and rustle outside became a potential harbinger of revelation or terror. The media attention, though intended to assist, magnified this psychological strain. Each headline a reminder that the world was aware of their suffering, yet powerless to provide closure. Families became prisoners of speculation, debating the plausibility of tips, leads, and confessions, weighing them against the stark reality that, despite years of searching, no definitive answers had emerged. The invisible weight of potential danger haunted every decision, driving at night, attending gatherings, even answering unknown calls, each act now filtered through the lens of suspicion and fear. Friends and neighbors, once sources of comfort, became unpredictable variables, their recollections incomplete, sometimes contradictory, sometimes tinged with guilt for perceived inaction. This uncertainty created a labyrinth of emotion where rational thought was constantly challenged by the imagination's darker corridors. Psychologists observing the families noted the profound impact of ambiguous loss, a phenomenon where the absence of evidence prevents closure, leaving the mind trapped in loops of memory, conjecture, and projection. The Streeter home, emptied of its occupants, but full of remnants, the dog, the purses, the untouched cigarettes, became both shrine and reminder, a place where grief and fear intermingled in palpable tension. Over time, the waiting itself transformed into an instrument of psychological control, imposed not by a single person, but by the unresolved forces surrounding the disappearance, the unknown perpetrator, the contaminated crime scene, the vanished messages, and the elusive trail that refused to yield its secrets. Each anniversary, each reference in media, reopened wounds, reinforcing the inescapable truth that some mysteries are designed not merely to confound investigators, but to haunt those left behind. The family's world had been inverted, ordinary. Life replaced with vigilance and dread, leaving them suspended in a liminal space where hope and despair existed simultaneously. A constant reminder that the world could shift in an instant, and that evil, unseen yet precise, could claim lives, and leave nothing but silence and the psychological echo of absence to endure forever. As the case grew colder, the weight of public expectation pressed heavily on Springfield law enforcement, fracturing confidence and sowing tension within the investigative ranks. Officers confronted not only the logistical challenge of an unprecedented disappearance, but also the psychological burden of mounting scrutiny, both locally and nationally. Tips poured in relentlessly, some plausible, many facts, some deliberately misleading. On each required evaluation, a drain on resources and patience. Intergency cooperation, which might have provided the leverage necessary to break through the confusion, was hampered by jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic delays. Federal, state, and local authorities each held fragments of information, but without a unified approach, critical leads slipped through the cracks. Investigators struggled to reconcile timelines, verify alibis, and distinguish between valuable intelligence and wishful thinking, while the media amplified every misstep, every unanswered question, shaping a narrative of incompetence that deepened public mistrust. Residents, frustrated and fearful, speculated openly, offering their own theories, pressuring police to act with speed and certainty that the fragmented evidence could not support. The contamination of the Del Mar residence, already a devastating blow to forensic clarity, became emblematic of the case's broader difficulties. Tangible evidence had been compromised, yet intangible clues: the erased phone message, the agitated family dog, the perfectly left possessions, remained tantalizingly out of reach, leaving officers dependent on the fallible memories of neighbors and friends. Each day brought a fresh cycle of hope dashed by dead ends, each lead evaluated and discarded, fostering a creeping cynicism even among the most experienced detectives. This sense of powerlessness transformed into institutional tension. Some officers advocated aggressive public engagement to generate tips, while others favored caution to avoid contaminating the investigation further. Amid this, the family's desperation collided with procedural caution, leading to mistrust of the very people charged with uncovering the truth. As weeks became months, the relentless pressure eroded morale, feeding a quiet resignation that the case might never be solved. And yet, within this frustration, a darker truth emerged. The disappearance had exposed the limitations of conventional investigation against a carefully orchestrated crime, revealing how a meticulous predator could manipulate not only the victims but also the system designed to protect them. Law enforcement, the families, and the public found themselves trapped in a cycle where hope, fear, and suspicion collided, and where the unseen hand that had taken Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl continued to dictate the narrative from the shadows, proving that mastery over human behavior and institutional constraints could render the most sophisticated investigative machinery almost powerless against deliberate, hidden malevolence. As the investigation unfolded, sporadic witness sightings and cryptic tips began to surface, each offering fragments of a truth too elusive to grasp. People reported glimpses of a familiar car parked in unusual locations, strangers lurking near the edges of neighborhoods, and fleeting figures moving through dimly lit streets, details that could neither be fully confirmed nor entirely dismissed. One anonymous call to the America's Most Wanted hotline on December 31st, 1992, claimed prime knowledge of the women's fate, only to end abruptly when the line disconnected, leaving police haunted by the tantalizing possibility that someone with real information had intentionally withdrawn. These instances suggested more than random criminal activity. They hinted at an organized intelligence, a network of individuals aware of and possibly complicit in the disappearance. Whether through gang affiliation, criminal alliances, or simple opportunism, the network seemed to exploit Springfield's normalcy, using social gatherings, familiar routes, and predictable routines to mask their actions. Even casual observers, family, friends, and neighbors became potential conduits of hidden knowledge, whether through intentional silence or fear of reprisal. The pattern of tips and sightings formed an intricate lattice of uncertainty, forcing investigators to navigate an environment where the line between credible information and deliberate deception was razor-thin. Reports of strange calls, sexual, and unexplained behavior in the days following the disappearance added layers of psychological menace, suggesting that the perpetrators or their associates sought to intimidate, taunt, and manipulate the community, reinforcing the sense that the women's absence was not merely physical but symbolic, an assertion of control over both victims and observers. Analysts began to consider the possibility of a coordinated operation, a deliberate exploitation of social networks and human predictability, which would explain the precision of the abduction. The clean scene despite broken glass, and the absence of definitive leads. The network, if it existed, operated invisibly, leaving only whispers, shadows, and the occasional disconnected call as testimony to its reach. Every new tip, every unverified sighting, reinforced the chilling reality that multiple individuals may have known more than they were willing to reveal, that the women's disappearance was not the work of a solitary mind but a calculated manipulation of an entire community, and that the boundaries of law, trust, and ordinary life could be silently subverted by those willing to act with patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness. Springfield itself became an unwitting participant in this orchestration, its streets, homes, and routines exploited in ways no one could have imagined, leaving the victims, the families, and the investigators ensnared in a web woven from fear, silence, and deliberate omission. Communication, or its absence, became one of the most sinister threads in the Springfield 3 case, a weapon wielded by an unseen hand to manipulate perception, control, fear, and erode certainty. The erased message on Leavitt's answering machine, heard by Janice McCall only to vanish permanently, became a symbol of lost opportunity. A potential clue snatched away before it could illuminate even a fragment of the truth. Investigators recognized the profound psychological impact, knowing that someone had spoken, that a message existed, and yet being unable to recover it, transformed hope into a gnawing frustration, an invisible torment that lingered in the minds of those searching. Kirby's reports of obscene, sexualized phone calls, disconnected, threatening, ambiguous, hinted at a predator who understood the power of suggestion, of leaving terror suspended just beyond comprehension. These calls were not mere pranks. They were psychological probes, testing boundaries, gauging reaction, and reinforcing a climate of vulnerability and unease. Each unanswered call, each blank recording, amplified the sense that the women had been observed, monitored, and removed. from their ordinary lives with precision. The implications were staggering. Someone had the capability to intrude on private space, to manipulate routine communication, to erase or exploit the traces of connection that might otherwise have offered warning or aid. Law enforcement grappled with the limitations of 1990s technology. Analog systems that permitted messages to vanish irretrievably, leaving only the memory of content too vague to act upon. Yet within that vagueness lay a terrifying clarity. The abduction had been executed with understanding, knowledge, and foresight, using silence as a tool, absence as evidence, and communication as a weapon. The calls and messages, fragmented as they were, became instruments of control not only over the victims, but over the families and investigators, shaping behavior, redirecting focus, and perpetuating uncertainty. Each new phone tip, each contradictory report, reinforced the notion that the perpetrators had orchestrated the disappearance with a consciousness that extended beyond mere physical removal. They had engineered confusion, anxiety, and doubt, exploiting every technological and social limitation to ensure the disappearance would linger unresolved. In Springfield, this manipulation of communication cemented a psychological reality. The women's voices, once alive in conversation, in laughter, in argument, were now suspended in an eerie void, a haunting reminder that the most insidious form of control is not physical but cognitive, the ability to dictate what others know, believe, or fear. Even decades later, the specter of those calls lingers, a testament to the darkness that can be delivered, not with hands, but with silence, erasure, and the deliberate withholding of truth from those who most need it. As the years stretched on, the Springfield 3 case drew a shadowy parade of voices, some sincere, some manipulative, each offering fragments of knowledge that carried the dual weight of potential insight and profound deception. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and robber, emerged from this murky landscape, claiming he knew the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be found. To authorities, his words were simultaneously chilling and unreliable, a dangerous mixture of bravado and self-interest. Yet the precision of certain details, names, locations, timing forced investigators to listen closely, to consider that even a boastful criminal might harbor genuine awareness of horrors others could not perceive. Similarly, Gerald Carnahan, whose history included rape and murder, and his network of associates in criminal subcultures, surfaced repeatedly in leads that blurred the line between credibility and sensationalism. Each confession, each tip, carried with it a psychological calculus, the potential to advance the investigation or to deliberately mislead, to provoke anxiety or to assert control over law enforcement and the families. Analysts recognized a grim pattern emerging from this morass. Predators often seek recognition not only through their acts, but through the fear they cultivate in others, an invisible echo that extends their influence far beyond the immediate. Crime. Even the most seemingly trivial statement, cryptic remark about location, an ambiguous recollection of a vehicle or a face could alter the trajectory of the investigation, creating labyrinthine pathways that investigators were forced to navigate with caution, skepticism, and suspicion. The result was a chilling tension between the need for actionable intelligence and the risk of being manipulated by those who thrived in darkness. The community, meanwhile, became enmeshed in the uncertainty, watching as names were floated, retracted, and dissected, understanding that the very act of claiming knowledge could be weaponized against both victims and those seeking justice. Each false lead, each taunting confession, compounded the sense of powerlessness. reinforcing the unsettling reality that those who perpetrated or knew of the crime might be exercising influence even from behind bars, shaping perception, sowing doubt, and prolonging fear. Springfield itself, the streets, the homes, the routines, became part of this psychological theater, a stage for acts of cruelty that extended beyond the initial disappearance. The women's absence was now magnified by the presence of deliberate misinformation, by the voices of criminals who understood the value of suspense and the leverage of ambiguity. The investigation, already challenged by contamination and erasure, was now entangled in a web of manipulation, proving that in a world where knowledge is power, even the smallest assertion of awareness can cast shadows over truth, leaving those seeking justice suspended between revelation and deception, never certain whom to trust, and never safe from the psychological reach of the perpetrators. Time, relentless and impartial, became both enemy and accomplice in the Springfield 3 case, eroding memories, fragmenting testimonies, and shifting the landscape of hope into something almost unrecognizable. As years turned into decades, witnesses aged, details blurred, and what once had been vivid, the way Susie laughed at a joke, Stacy's careful mannerisms, Cheryl's insistence on routine, became fogged fragments, shadows of certainty that could no longer guide investigators with precision. Every recollection, no matter how sincere, was filtered through decades of human psychology, where the mind fills gaps with inference, imagination, or subconscious reinterpretation. Yet time also heightened obsession, transforming families, friends, and detectives into relentless archivists of what should have been ordinary lives, compelled to preserve memory, detail, and minutiae that others would forget. Anniversary dates, media retrospectives, and commemorative events became rituals, moments where grief and curiosity intertwined, reigniting the psychological tension that had never fully abated. Investigators found themselves chasing echoes, reconstructing scenarios with incomplete data, attempting to overlay faded recollections onto forensic possibilities that had already been compromised. In this interplay between fading memory and obsessive reconstruction, hope became a double-edged sword. It propelled search, inquiry, and public awareness, yet also fostered despair when every lead dissolved into ambiguity. The human desire for closure clashed violently with the precision of disappearance. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more the absence itself asserted control, dictating the emotional tempo of those left behind. Decades magnified uncertainty into a spectral presence, a constant companion that lurked at the edges of daily life, intruding upon sleep, conversation, and contemplation, ensuring that the crime remained alive in the collective consciousness, haunting both those who remembered and those who only knew the story through This intersection of time, memory, and obsession created a unique psychological ecosystem, where hope and fear, certainty and doubt coexisted uneasily, feeding one another. Each passing year without resolution reinforced the narrative of impossibility, transforming what had been a sequence of events into a legend of absence. A story in which the details mattered not only for justice, but for the preservation of identity, morality, and communal understanding. In the silence left by Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, time became a tangible force, pressing against the psyche of those seeking answers, and demanding a reckoning not merely with crime but with the human capacity to endure ambiguity, to wrest meaning from absence, and to confront the haunting possibility that some truths, however desperately sought, may forever lie beyond reach, hidden in the shadows where memory, time and fear converge, even after decades. The Springfield 3 case continues to produce tantalizing yet maddening threads leads that tease resolution, without ever delivering it, evidence that promises answers but remains frustratingly inaccessible. Ground-penetrating radar scans of supposed burial sites, tips from alleged psychics or witnesses, and confessions from imprisoned criminals have all been pursued. Yet each trail dissolves into ambiguity or is discredited, leaving investigators trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. The call from the America's Most Wanted hotline, abruptly cut off before details could be shared, remains one of the most haunting symbols of opportunity lost, a reminder that the truth may have passed through human hands and yet been deliberately withheld or erased. Investigators have revisited the Delmar residence repeatedly, analyzing the subtle clues that survived contamination: the agitated family dog, the broken porch light, the neatly folded clothing, and the possessions left behind us, though the house itself held a memory of the night that time and intrusion had not entirely erased. Criminal profiles, from Larry Dwayne Hall to Gerald Carnahan to Robert Craig Cox, provide chilling insights into the possible perpetrators, yet none can be conclusively tied to the crime, leaving open the possibility that someone with meticulous planning, understanding of human behavior, and a network of collaborators executed a disappearance designed to evade detection permanently. Every tip, every rumor, and every theory underscores a terrifying reality. The women may have vanished not because of chance, but because they were targeted with precision, and their removal was calculated to manipulate not just the victims, but an entire community. The absence of bodies, the destruction of potential evidence, and the deliberate confusion of witnesses all point to a criminal sophistication that defies ordinary investigation, suggesting that this may be a case where closure is not simply delayed but actively denied, and yet the human need for understanding compels continued attention. Family, law enforcement, and true crime researchers alike remain fixated on every anomaly, every unexplained detail, hoping that one final observation, forgotten photograph, an overlooked message, a memory long buried might pierce the decades of silence. This tension between hope and impossibility is precisely what allows the Springfield 3 to haunt the imagination. The certainty of their disappearance collides with the indeterminacy of their fate, creating a psychological vortex that draws in those who dare to investigate, forcing them to confront the darkest corners of human intention, the vulnerability of ordinary lives, and the haunting truth that some crimes are designed not merely to victimize but to persist as enduring enigmas, shaping fear and fascination across generations in a town forever shadowed by absence. After more than 3 decades, the story of Susie Streeter, Stacey McCall, and Cheryl Levitt remains a silent indictment of darkness that can exist behind ordinary doors, in quiet neighborhoods, and within the very routines we take for granted. The women vanished without a trace, leaving behind possessions, cars, and an entire community gripped by questions that refuse to be answered. Their absence is more than physical. It is psychological, a void that transforms everyday life into a theater of vigilance and speculation. The unanswered calls, erased messages, and tantalizingly incomplete tips illustrate how control, manipulation, and malevolence can extend far beyond the moment of crime, reaching into memory, routine, and perception. Investigators and families alike are left navigating a labyrinth built by meticulous design, a crime executed with precision, amplified by fear and preserved in absence. The chilling reality is that those responsible may never face justice, and the answers may remain forever hidden. A testament to the limits of human understanding when confronted with calculated evil. And yet, the story endures, because it is more than an investigation. It is a cautionary tale, a meditation on the fragility of security, the danger of complacency, and the enduring power of silence to shape fear and obsession as you absorb. This, consider the invisible forces that shape lives, communities, and history itself. The unknown, the deliberate, the hidden. Reflect on the ways ordinary routines can be exploited, and how courage, persistence, and vigilance remain humanity's only defense against the darkness that lurks just beyond perception. If you are watching this story unfold, take a moment now to engage not passively, but as part of the memory of these women, as part of the effort to confront what has been hidden. Comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," twice below, to acknowledge the weight of this truth and your presence in witnessing it. Let us know from where you are watching. Share your location in the comments and become part of the global network of those who refuse to forget. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that the silence that allowed this crime to persist is never repeated, so that awareness spreads and the story of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl continues to haunt, educate, and remind us all that darkness can strike anywhere, and that the vigilance of witnesses, family, and communities is the only safeguard against the unimaginable. This is not just a story of disappearance, it is a testament to endurance, to unanswered questions, and to the haunting truth that some crimes live beyond time, compelling us to remember, to question, and to never forget the void left behind by those who vanished into silence.